The morning light was barely shining through the heavy curtains, but I was awake. At my age, sleep is a luxury rarely fully enjoyed. 73 is no joke. My body reminds me of itself constantly. My joints ache before the rain, or my heart skips a beat, making me freeze for a moment. I rose slowly from the bed, feeling the familiar heaviness in my lower back. The house greeted me with a familiar silence. Big, too big for a lonely old man. 2 floors, 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, all empty except for my bedroom and study. The rest of the rooms had long ago become a warehouse of memories I didn't dare to throw away or rearrange. I brewed a strong cup of coffee and settled into a chair by the window overlooking the quiet street of La Vista. The city was waking up leisurely, as befitted a small suburb. A young couple with a stroller, a neighbor walking his golden retriever, the mailman on his bike. Life went on. Only mine froze years ago when Audrey took Elliot and left, leaving behind a void that nothing could fill. I reached for the wooden box on the table. Inside held the few pictures I had saved. Elliot at 5 years old fishing, holding his first bass he caught. His smile then was genuine, his gaze trusting. He looked at me as a hero. Who knew that just a few years later there would be only cold aloofness in his eyes? Audrey never knew how to lose with dignity. Our marriage started to fall apart before Elliot was born, but we held on. For the sake of propriety, for the sake of the child, so we justified years of mutual resentment and quiet hatred. I was immersed in my work, building my investment business, while she spent the money I earned and complained about her lack of attention. When Elliot turned 13, I decided I could no longer live a lie. Divorce was inevitable, though I naively thought we could part in a civilized manner. "You're leaving us for your precious money," Audrey yelled the night I announced my decision. "Elliot will never forgive you for this." "I'm not leaving anyone," I tried to argue. "We just won't live together anymore. I'll always take care of you, always be a father to Elliot. Let's see what he'll say when he finds out you chose your career and young secretaries over your family." That was a lie. There were no secretaries and there were no affairs. There was just a dead tired man who no longer saw the point in pretending to be happy. The court awarded joint custody, but Audrey did everything she could to destroy my relationship with my son. Every weekend that Elliot was supposed to spend with me, she came up with urgent school projects, sporting events, or sudden illnesses. When we did manage to meet, the boy was withdrawn and cold. "Mom said you left us for money," he said at dinner one night, not looking up from his plate. "That's not true, Elliot. Mom and I just couldn't be happy together, but I'll never stop loving you." He was silent, but I could see that my words didn't hit the mark. By the time he was 18, our visits had become a formality, and when he went to college, he stopped coming altogether. I kept sending checks for his education, his first car, his first apartment. Audrey called regularly demanding an increase in child support, even though my son was well past the age of majority. "The boy should have a decent standard of living," she said. "Not everyone's father is a heartless rich man." I paid, not out of guilt, but out of hope that one day Elliot would realize that I hadn't abandoned him, that I'd continued to care, even if it was at a distance. That hope slowly faded with each passing year, but I clung to it as the last anchor linking me to my son. Over time, my business grew. Investments in technology startups proved incredibly successful, and by the time I was in my 60s, I could afford to retire, leaving the running of the company to talented young partners. I bought this house in a quiet neighborhood in La Vista, looking forward to a peaceful old age, maybe even hoping that the grandchildren would come to visit on weekends. But there were no grandchildren. Or rather, I didn't know if there were any. Contact with Elliot was cut off for good when he turned 25. The last call was short and painful. "I don't want your money," he said then. "I want you to leave us alone. You've done enough to destroy our family." "Elliot, I'll never." But the phone was already ringing off the hook. 18 years have passed since then. Sometimes I tried to find information about him through mutual acquaintances or the internet, but my son seemed to disappear. All I knew was that he'd graduated from college and taken a job with a finance company in another state. Audrey died 5 years ago. A stroke. I learned of it by accident, from an obituary in the local hometown paper. I wasn't invited to the funeral, of course. I sent flowers and condolences to the funeral home, but received no reply. Setting aside my empty cup, I got up and went to the computer. Modern technology was hard for me, but I tried to keep up with the times. The internet became my window to the world, especially when my physical strength began to fail. I rarely went on social networks. Who needs the posts of a lonely old man? But occasionally I checked the pages of a few old acquaintances to keep up with the main events. As usual, I was scrolling through my news feed without much interest when my eye caught on a familiar name. Frank Wilcox, a former co-worker of mine, shared a photo with the caption, "Getting ready for my niece Victoria's wedding. Future son-in-law Elliot is a great guy." My heart skipped a beat. The photo showed a young couple. The girl with long blonde hair was smiling at the camera, and standing next to her was a man I hardly recognized as my son. He had grown older. His hair had early gray, but his eyes, my eyes, looked out of the photograph with the same wariness I saw in the mirror every day. With trembling hands, I opened Frank's profile and began browsing through his recent postings. A few more photos from the wedding preparations, comments about the upcoming festivities. "The Langley family is not skimping on their daughter's wedding," Frank wrote. "The ceremony will take place next Saturday at the Grand Hotel of La Vista." La Vista, my town. How ironic. The son who had avoided me for 2 decades would be getting married just a few miles from my home. I leaned back in my chair, trying to comprehend this information. Elliot would be getting married. I could be a grandfather, and he hadn't even seen fit to inform me, even though he'd arrived practically on my doorstep. A wave of lingering pain was rising in my chest. How many times over the years had I imagined our meeting? How many times had I rehearsed the words I would say to him? Sometimes in these imaginary dialogues I was restrained and forgave all the offenses, sometimes expressed all the accumulated bitterness. But in any case, I wanted this meeting. I wanted to see my son, to know what kind of man he had become. And now this opportunity has come. I could have just come to the wedding. No invitation, no warning. What's he going to do? Kick his own father out? Or maybe this would be the moment that would change everything. The decision came suddenly, and I felt energy spill through my body for the first time in a long time. I'm going to this wedding. No matter what my son's reaction will be, I have to try one more time. One last time. After all, how long do I have left? 5 years? 10, if I was lucky? I didn't want to die without talking to the only close person I had left. Rising, I walked over to the window. The sun had risen higher, and the street was filled with people hurrying about their business. Life went on, no matter what. And maybe all was not yet lost for me. I went back to my computer and did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I opened my email. I needed to contact my tailor and order a new suit for an upcoming event. No, not a new one. My old suit, the one I'd first taken Elliot fishing in, should still be in my closet. Even though it was long out of fashion, it meant more to me than any designer new product. The week before the wedding flew by like a day. I spent it in a strange excitement I hadn't felt in years. I pulled out an old cufflink box from the mezzanine, a gift from my father for my 20th birthday, and cleaned the expensive watch I usually wore only on special occasions. Now that occasion had definitely come. I thought about the gift for a long time. What do fathers give their sons for their weddings? Especially fathers who weren't invited, who hadn't seen their children in almost 2 decades? Money seemed too trivial a solution, albeit the most practical. In the end, I settled on a gold watch from a Swiss brand, a classic that never goes out of style. An expensive, but not a gift that screams its price. When the box with the watch was wrapped in elegant paper and tied with a ribbon, I went about my own closet. My old dark graphite suit hung in the very back of my closet, protected by a cover from dust and time. I carefully pulled it out and spread it out on the bed. The fabric was a little faded, but it was still in excellent condition. This was the suit I'd bought 35 years ago when I'd gotten my first major investment return. Not the most expensive, but perfectly tailored to fit, it had witnessed many important events in my life. I wore it when I took Elliot to his first day of school. It was also the suit I wore when I received an award from the city's Chamber of Commerce for my contribution to local business. Perhaps it was in this suit that I hoped to walk my son down the aisle one day. When I tried it on, I was surprised to find that it still fit like a suit. I was a little looser in the shoulders, for the years had taken their toll, and my once athletic figure had lost its former stateliness. But on the whole, I looked quite presentable. The gray in my hair and the deep wrinkles on my face gave me the look of a respectable old gentleman. The morning of the wedding day was clear and warm. I carefully shaved, styled my hair, and put on my suit. The mirror reflected an older but still sturdy man with a straight back and a determined look. I slipped the watch box into the inside pocket of my jacket and left the house. The Grand Hotel La Vista was housed in a historic building in the center of town. Once the mansion of one of the city's founders, it was now a luxurious venue for high-end events. I parked my modest sedan amidst a string of expensive cars, and for a moment I questioned my decision. What if Elliot really does kick me out? What if I just ruined his day? But it was too late to back out. I got out of the car and headed toward the main entrance. The hotel lobby was decorated with floral arrangements and white ribbons. A young man in uniform was standing at the guest reception desk. "Good afternoon, sir. Your invitation, please," he addressed me politely. "I'm afraid I don't have an invitation," I answered honestly. "I am the groom's father, Christopher Hutton." The young man checked the list and frowned. "I'm sorry, but you're not on the guest list. I can't let you in without an invitation or confirmation from the family." At that moment, an elegant middle-aged woman approached the counter with a clipboard in hand. Judging by her confident appearance and name tag, she was the wedding planner. "What's the problem, Michael?" she asked, giving me an assessing look. "This gentleman claims to be the groom's father, but he's not on the guest list." The woman turned to me, and I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She must have been wondering why the groom's father wasn't on the guest list. Perhaps she was thinking about the family drama that one prefers not to mention on a happy day. "Mr. Hutton, do I understand correctly?" she asked. "Yes, Christopher Hutton. My son and I have a, complicated relationship, but I'd like to congratulate him on his big day." She hesitated, shifting her gaze from me to the list on the clipboard. "Wait here, please. I'll consult with the groom." She left, and I stayed at the counter, feeling the curious glances of the arriving guests. A few minutes later, the organizer returned with a somewhat confused expression on her face. "Mr. Hutton said he has no objection to your presence at the ceremony," she informed me. "Please proceed to the main hall. The ceremony will begin in 20 minutes. I thanked her and headed toward the back of the building. So Elliot knows I'm coming. He could have turned me down, but he didn't. That's something. The main hall of the hotel had been transformed beyond recognition. Rows of white chairs with gold bows, a huge arch of fresh flowers at the window overlooking the garden, a string quartet in the corner playing classical melodies. Everything breathed luxury and refinement. The guests were already taking their seats. I chose a chair in the last row, on the edge. I didn't want to attract attention, but I didn't want to miss any details of the ceremony. An elderly lady in an extravagant hat with feathers sat next to me. She gave me a curious look and leaned closer. "Are you from the bride or groom's side?" she asked in a southern accent. "Groom's side," I answered briefly. "Oh, so you know Elliot. A remarkable young man, isn't he? So suited to our Victoria. I'm her great-aunt, Agatha Langley. And you are?" "Christopher Hutton," I introduced myself, deciding not to specify the degree of kinship. "Let her guess." "Hutton?" She squinted. "I don't recall Elliot ever mentioning a relative with that last name. You must be a distant relative." "You could say that," I said evasively. "It's been a long time since we've seen each other." "I understand," she nodded, though I could tell from the look in her eyes that she didn't understand much. "The Langley family is very proud of this union. Victoria is a real gem of a family, and Elliot, well, he's a promising young man with a bright future in finance. Did you hear they're going to spend their wedding trip in a private villa in Italy?" Victoria's father insisted. I nodded politely, letting the stream of small talk flow past me. Meanwhile, the room was filling up with guests in expensive clothes and impeccable hairstyles. I could tell by their clothes who belonged to high society and who didn't. My old suit, though of high quality, stood out against the latest designer creations. Agatha, noticing my outfit, pressed her lips together slightly. "These young fashionistas are obsessed with their brands," she said, obviously trying to smooth over the awkwardness. "Practicality and durability were prized in our day, weren't they?" I just smiled back. Her condescending tone was more eloquent than any words. Soon the music changed, the guests quieted, and all eyes turned to the beginning of the aisle between the rows. Elliot entered, accompanied by a tall man, probably the best man. My son looked impeccable in a dark suit with an immaculately tied tie. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture straight, a real successful young man. I couldn't take my eyes off him. The last time I'd seen him, he'd been a gangly young man with a perpetually frowning expression. Now there was a mature man standing before me, so much like me at his age that my heart clenched with a mixture of pride and bitterness. As Elliot took his place at the altar, his gaze slid down the rows of guests. Our eyes met for a moment, and I knew he'd noticed me. No nod, no gesture of greeting, just a slight tension in the line of his shoulders and a fleeting change of expression that only someone who knew him well would have noticed. He looked at me as if I were just one of many guests, a casual acquaintance or coworker. My heart dropped. I'd expected coldness, even hostility, but not this ostentatious unrecognition. Elliot pretended not to recognize his own father. The music grew louder, the guests rose from their seats, and a procession of bridesmaids in pale blue dresses moved down the aisle between the rows. Behind them, the bride walked arm in arm with a tall man with silvery temples, obviously her father. Victoria was beautiful in a lush white dress embroidered with small pearls. Her face glowed with happiness as she approached the altar where my son waited. Throughout the ceremony, I couldn't stop looking at Elliot. In his every gesture, in the turn of his head, in the way he held his hands, I saw traits I remembered from his childhood, mixed with new, unfamiliar habits. Who had instilled in him this confident posture? Who had taught him to smile so discreetly? Who was there for him as he transformed from a withdrawn teenager into this confident man? After exchanging vows and rings, the newlyweds moved toward the exit to the applause of the guests. As they passed by my row, Elliot glanced at me again, but made no indication that he recognized me. I felt the color flood my face. Was his hatred for me so strong that he was willing to deny my very existence? The guests began to leave the room, heading for the banquet hall on the first floor. Agatha Langley, my chatty neighbor, tugged at my sleeve. "Come on, darling, don't miss the buffet before the main reception." I hear the Langleys ordered champagne straight from France. I let myself be drawn into the lavish banquet hall. There was an atmosphere of festivity and exuberance. Waiters in white gloves handed out glasses of champagne and exquisite canapes on silver trays. Crystal chandeliers cast sparkling glints on snow-white tablecloths and floral arrangements of white and blue orchids. I took a glass of champagne and stepped back against the wall, watching the guests. They were grouped in small circles, exchanging pleasantries and compliments, discussing the ceremony and outfits. No one paid attention to the elderly man in the outdated suit. The newlyweds entered the hall to applause and were immediately surrounded by congratulators. I saw Elliot lean over to his wife, whisper something in her ear, and she laughed. I saw him shaking hands with the guests, accepting congratulations with a genuine smile. He was in his element, confident and happy, among people who appreciated and respected him. I took a sip of champagne, feeling a bitterness that had nothing to do with the flavor of the drink. Perhaps I shouldn't have come. What had I hoped to find here? Reconciliation? Forgiveness? My son had made it clear that he did not wish to acknowledge me, not even on his wedding day. I was interrupted by a loud voice with a distinct British accent. "And you must be the mysterious Mr. Hutton who was whispered about in the hall?" I turned around and saw a tall man in his 50s, wearing an impeccable ivory suit. His sallow face was a mixture of curiosity and mild contempt. "Sebastian Langley, father of the bride," he introduced himself, extending his hand to shake. "Agatha tells me you're a relative of Elliot's who wasn't on the guest list." "Christopher Hutton." I shook his hand. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Langley. It's a beautiful ceremony." Yes, it was top-notch. My Victoria deserves nothing but the best. "I must say, you've put us in a bit of an awkward position with your appearance. Elliot never mentioned a relative named Christopher." There was a question in his tone that I wasn't prepared to answer directly. "We have a complicated family relationship," I said evasively. I hadn't seen Elliot in a long time, and I wanted to congratulate him on this special day. Sebastian Langley looked at my suit with an appraising eye, and his lips formed into a condescending smile. I understand. Family dramas. They're so uncomfortable, aren't they? Especially when they show up at the wrong time. He was approached by two other men, Langley's relatives, judging by their facial features. Sebastian introduced them as his brothers, Oliver and Edward. Their gazes, sliding over my suit, were equally appraising and arrogant. "So you're related to the groom?" Oliver asked, not hiding his skepticism. "Funny how Elliot never mentioned you." "Funny indeed," Edward said, grinning. "Although, looking at your closet, I'm beginning to understand why." They laughed, not hiding their disdain. Sebastian pretended to pull his brothers back, but his own smile was no less insulting. "Pay no attention to my brothers, Mr. Hutton. They're just concerned for the welfare of our Victoria. You know, we checked Elliot's background and financial situation very carefully before agreeing to this marriage. There are certain standards in our family." I remained outwardly calm, though inside I was beginning to feel resentment. These people, knowing nothing about me except my shabby suit, had already passed judgment on my status and my value as a human being. "I'm sure your daughter has made an excellent choice," I said discreetly. "Elliot is an intelligent young man." "Oh, absolutely," Sebastian nodded. "And more importantly, he has excellent prospects. The senior partner at his firm is an old friend of mine, so he's well on his way. Not that my Victoria needs it, of course. Her grandfather's trust fund guarantees her a trouble-free existence." The Langley brothers continued to stare at me with ill-concealed contempt. Oliver leaned over to Sebastian and whispered something in his ear, and then all three of them grinned again. I felt the color rush back to my face. Were they laughing at my costume? At the fact that I didn't look rich enough for their circle? The urge to tell them what I thought of their snobbery was becoming almost irresistible. But at that moment my gaze fell on Elliot, who was standing at the other end of the room, his arm around his new wife's waist. They were laughing, surrounded by young friends, and they looked genuinely happy. I couldn't ruin my son's day by making a scene with his fiancé's relatives. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen," I said, setting aside my unfinished glass, "I'd like to congratulate the newlyweds." Of course," Sebastian nodded with the same indulgent smile. "Just don't forget to leave a gift on the table at the entrance. Tradition, you know." I headed across the hall toward the newlyweds, feeling the mocking glances of the Langley brothers. Along the way, I noticed some of the guests whispering, glancing in my direction. Apparently, the rumor of an uninvited guest had already spread through the hall. As I approached Elliot and Victoria, I stopped a few paces away, waiting for them to finish their conversation with the group of young men. My heart was pounding in my chest like crazy. What would I say to my son? How would he react to being addressed directly? Finally, Elliot turned and saw me. Recognition flashed in his eyes for a moment, then turned to cold aloofness. He leaned toward his wife and whispered something in her ear. Victoria glanced curiously in my direction, then nodded and stepped back to the bridesmaids. Elliot turned to me with a polite but empty smile, the same smile he gave all the guests. "Good afternoon," he said, as if he were seeing me for the first time in his life. "Thank you for coming to our wedding." The banquet hall gradually filled with guests. Elegant waiters in black suits placed champagne glasses on long tables, covered with white tablecloths. Floral arrangements of white lilies and blue hydrangeas adorned each table, and crystal chandeliers cast soft light on polished cutlery and fine glass glasses. After a brief and cold exchange of pleasantries with my son, I stepped aside, watching as he returned to his young wife and the guests who surrounded the newlyweds in a tight ring. Elliot hadn't introduced me to Victoria, hadn't introduced me to any of his friends. He treated me as if I were an unfamiliar guest who'd accidentally wandered into the celebration. The watch box was still in the inside pocket of my jacket, but I hesitated to hand it over. From Elliot's reaction, he didn't want anyone to know we were related, and I wasn't about to embarrass him. Not now, anyway. The banquet host announced that the guests were being asked to take their seats at the tables. I examined the seating chart at the front of the room and found that I'd been assigned a seat at the far table, almost right next to the kitchen. Apparently, Elliot had instructed that I be seated as far away from the main action as possible. At my table were an elderly distant relative of the bride, whom everyone seemed to have forgotten. A young couple by their looks, Elliot's co-workers, not too close. and a full middle-aged man who introduced himself as a university friend of the bride's father. Terribly uncomfortable table, the older lady complained, settling into her seat. Sebastian had always been like that. The main thing was to make him feel good, and he didn't care about anyone else. Last time I'd been at the family Christmas dinner, I'd been seated at the door too. I nodded sympathetically, not going into the details of my own situation. The young couple was too busy whispering among themselves to participate in the general conversation, and the full man was busily studying the menu and wine list. "Are you a relative of the bride or groom?" the older lady asked, adjusting a string of pearls around her neck. "Of the groom," I answered briefly, hoping she wouldn't elaborate on the details. "Oh, I see," she nodded. "I'm Gertrude Pembroke, Victoria's maternal great-aunt. I've never had much respect in the family, but I was invited to the wedding out of courtesy." At that moment, two men I recognized at once as Oliver and Edward Langley, the bride's father's brothers, the same ones who had made fun of my costume at the buffet. They were obviously looking for their seats at another table, but they stopped when they saw me. "Ah, Mr. Hutton, right?" Oliver said with the same condescending smile. "I see you found a good place to sit. I hope you're not too noisy in the kitchen," Edward added. "Though for a man of your caliber, it's probably a familiar setting." They both laughed, not hiding their disdain. I felt the blush of anger flood my cheeks, but I held it back. "Any place is suitable for watching the happiness of the young," I said as calmly as I could. "Oh, what a touching sentimentalism," Oliver said. "Tell me, is that suit from World War II? Amazing preservation for an antique." Gertrude Pembroke pressed her lips together, clearly displeased with the scene. "Gentlemen, don't you have anything better to do than harass the guests at the other tables?" she said with unexpected firmness in her voice. The Langley brothers looked at the old lady in surprise, then exchanged glances and shrugged their shoulders and walked away. "Don't mind them," Gertrude said to me. The Langley family had always been insufferably arrogant. Their father got rich on oil contracts in the 70s, and they've been looking down on everyone ever since, as if their wealth makes them better than other people. I nodded gratefully, appreciating her encouragement. For the next hour, Gertrude and I had a leisurely conversation about the weather, about real estate prices in La Vista, and about how the city had changed in recent years. She was a pleasant conversationalist, without the pretension and arrogance that characterized the rest of the Langley family. Dinner was served with pomp, in keeping with the general tone of the event. Each course was announced triumphantly, listing all the exquisite ingredients and methods of preparation. Champagne flowed in rivers. Toasts followed one after another. I watched the main table, where the newlyweds and their closest relatives were seated. Elliot looked happy and confident. He often leaned over to Victoria, whispering something in her ear, and she laughed, throwing her head back. Her father, Sebastian Langley, made a long toast about what a lovely couple they were, and how happy he was to welcome Elliot into the family. "You know," said Gertrude, noticing where my gaze was directed, "I hear the wedding cost a fortune. Victoria was always a spoiled child, demanding only the best. But Sebastian had insisted on splitting the cost in half." I looked at her in surprise. "Really? And Elliot had agreed?" "Oh, yes," she nodded. "He's trying very hard to impress the Langley family. You know how it is when a young man marries a girl from a wealthier family. Male pride and all that." The full man at our table, who until now had been busy devouring a fine meal, suddenly joined the conversation. "I'm sorry, I overheard. Are you talking about the wedding expenses?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I heard that all this splendor cost almost $1 million, and the groom contributed half of it." "1 million?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "That's a very impressive sum. About 900,000 to be exact." The man nodded. "I know because my company organizes such events, and I'm a little familiar with the prices. Renting this room, top-notch catering, flowers, music, a dress by a famous designer, it all costs a fortune." It got me thinking, if Elliot really paid half of the expenses, that's about 450,000. A huge sum for a young man, even with a good job in finance. Could he really have saved up that kind of money? Or, my thoughts were interrupted by the clinking of glasses. It was the best man calling for attention for his toast. He was followed by several other close friends of the newlyweds, each with warm wishes and amusing stories. I noticed that Elliot glanced in my direction from time to time, but immediately looked away if our eyes met. After dessert, most of the guests moved to the next room, where the dancing began. I stayed at the table, not feeling comfortable enough to join in the general merriment. Gertrude, too, preferred to stay, complaining of sore knees and fatigue. "So much noise," she sighed. "At my age, you prefer quieter entertainment?" A young couple and a full man left the table, so Gertrude and I were left alone. She proved to be an inexhaustible source of social gossip and family stories, which she told with surprising candor and a sense of humor. Victoria was always ambitious, she said, sipping champagne. She knew from childhood that she deserved only the best. Sebastian had raised her with the belief that the Langleys were a special family. When she'd brought Elliot to meet her parents, they'd interrogated him. Poor boy must have felt like he was being interviewed. "And he passed that interview," I remarked. "Oh yes," Gertrude nodded. "Brilliantly. I heard that he impressed Sebastian with his knowledge of the financial markets and his ambitious plans. But you know," she leaned closer, lowering her voice, "I think Elliot is a little exaggerating his abilities." "What do you mean?" I stepped forward, intrigued. "Well, he talks about his career as if he's already a partner in the firm, when in fact he's just on his way there. And then there's that wedding." She put her hand around the lavish hall. "I'm not sure he can afford it. I heard from my niece that he'd taken out a huge loan to pay for his half of the expenses." My heart clenched. A loan. 450,000. Elliot had gotten into that kind of debt just to match his fiance's family? To impress people like Sebastian Langley and his arrogant brothers? "Are you sure about the loan?" I asked. "As sure as someone who heard it third hand can be," Gertrude shrugged. "But I think it's true. He really wanted everything to be perfect, for the Langley family to accept him as an equal. You know how it is with young people. They'll do anything for love and acceptance." At that moment, applause and cheers came from the next room. Apparently, the first dance of the newlyweds had begun. I slowly rose from the table. "Excuse me, Gertrude. I'd like to watch." "Of course, dear," she nodded. "I think I'll stay here. Dancing is not for me anymore." I walked into the dance hall and stopped at the far wall. In the center of the room, Elliot and Victoria were twirling in a slow dance. They really were a beautiful couple. Young, happy, with a sparkle in their eyes and confidence in their future. The guests stood around, smiling and filming the dance on their phones. But my thoughts were preoccupied with what I had just learned. Elliot had taken out a huge loan, 450,000 to pay for this pompous wedding. He'd taken such a financial risk just to look good in the eyes of the Langley family, the same family whose members openly mocked me for my old suit. I could have easily paid for this wedding out of my savings. 450,000 was a considerable sum, but I could afford it. After my successful investment and the sale of my share of the business, I could afford it. But Elliot chose to go into debt rather than come to me. He wouldn't even acknowledge me to his new family. The bitterness and resentment that had been building up for years suddenly came with a new force. I remembered how Elliot had looked right through me like I was a stranger. How the Langley brothers had scoffed at my suit, not knowing I could buy their smug smiles along with all their oil rigs. How Sebastian Langley spoke condescendingly of his family's standards. At this point, the music ended, and the host of the evening announced that there would now be another toast from the father of the bride. Sebastian Langley stepped into the center of the room with a microphone in his hand. His face shone with pride and satisfaction. "Dear friends," he began, "today is a very special day for our family. My beautiful Victoria has found a worthy companion. Elliot is exactly the kind of man any father would want for his daughter. Smart, ambitious, from a good family." Something inside me switched. I could no longer stand by and listen to these hypocritical speeches. I couldn't let my son start his family life with a huge debt when I could have helped. But neither could I forgive his attitude toward me. I began to move through the crowd toward the center of the hall. The guests turned around in surprise as I passed by. When Sebastian finished his toast and the guests raised their glasses, I found myself standing next to him. "May I say a few words?" I asked, extending my hand toward the microphone. Sebastian looked stunned, but not wanting to create a scene, reluctantly handed me the microphone. Elliot, who was standing next to Victoria, turned pale when he saw me in the spotlight. I took a deep breath and looked around at the assembled guests. Their faces were curious and a little confused. Who was this older man in an old-fashioned suit who dared to interrupt the party? Good evening, I began, trying to keep my voice firm. Many of you are probably wondering who I am. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Christopher Hutton, and I'm Elliot's father. A whisper of surprise ran through the hall. Victoria looked at her husband in amazement, and then at me. Elliot froze in place, his face contorted with a mixture of shame and anger. I didn't get an invitation to this wedding, I continued. My son hadn't spoken to me in almost 20 years. Today he pretended not to recognize me, introduced me to everyone as a distant relative. I understand his feelings. Our relationship has been complicated, and I'm to blame for that. I paused, gathering my thoughts. The hall fell silent. All eyes were on me. Today, however, I learned something I can't ignore. My son took out a huge loan, $450,000 to pay for half the cost of this wedding. He took this financial risk to meet the standards of his fiance's family. Sebastian Langley twitched as if he were going to stop me, but I continued on, ignoring him. Well, I feel it is my duty to clarify the situation. I'm not a poor relative who's ashamed to be invited to a wedding. After selling my stake in the investment company, I have a considerable amount of money. I could easily pay for this whole wedding without noticing the difference in my bank account. Whispers swept through the room again, this time more animated. I saw the expressions change from disdain to surprise, from condescension to confusion. But I want to declare here and now, in front of all the guests, my voice became firm and loud, that I will not give a dime to pay this debt, not after my own son refused to recognize me in front of his new family, not after the ridicule from people who judge a man by his costume rather than his character and actions. I looked directly at Elliot, whose eyes widened with shock. Were you embarrassed of me, son? Worried that your old man in the shabby suit wouldn't fit in with the shiny company? Well, now they know who I am, and they know you're going to start your married life with a huge debt that you'll have to pay off over the years, though it could have been otherwise. After my words, there was a heavy silence in the hall. The faces of the guests ranged from shock to curiosity, from embarrassment to outright gloating. Victoria stood pale, looking from me to Elliot to her father. Sebastian Langley looked like he was about to explode with rage. His face flushed and his fingers clenched into fists. What a ridiculous thing to say! Oliver Langley was the first to break the silence, stepping forward. Do you really believe this man? He shows up uninvited in an old suit, and now he's trying to spoil the festivities with his wild statements. I turned to him calmly. You like my suit so much that you can't stop mentioning it, I said with a slight smile. It's really old, but I used to take my son Elliot to first grade in it. It's one of the few happy moments I keep in my memory. Elliot finally came out of his daze. His face was contorted with anger and shame. That's enough, he gritted through his teeth, stepping toward me. You have no right to make a scene here. This is my wedding. Your wedding that you couldn't afford, I said quietly but firmly. $450,000 in debt is no joke, son, especially at the beginning of married life. Is it true? Victoria's voice shook as she turned to Elliot. You took out a loan to pay for the wedding? Why didn't you tell me? Vicky, I'll explain everything later. Elliot tried to take her hand, but she pulled away. No, you explain now, Sebastian intervened, his voice ringing with barely contained anger. What's going on, Elliot? Who is this man? What kind of debt nonsense is he talking about? Elliot looked around the room full of tense faces and seemed to realize that there was no point in denying the obvious. Yes, that's my father, he finally admitted. We haven't spoken in years. And yes, I took out a loan to pay my share of the wedding expenses. But I plan to get by. I have a good job and prospects. Prospects? Sebastian said indignantly. You said you were already a junior partner in the firm, that your investments were generating a steady income. Yeah, exaggerated some of the details, Elliot mumbled, lowering his eyes. I knew how important status was to you, and I wanted to impress you. Victoria took a step back, as if seeing her husband for the first time. You lied to my family? Lied to me? Pretended to be someone else all this time? There was a buzz of voices in the room. The guests were talking about the scandal, some openly enjoying the drama, others looking embarrassed and awkwardly shuffling from foot to foot. I stood in the center of this chaos and felt strangely calm. The truth was finally coming out. As bitter as it was better than lies and pretense. I think we all need to calm down, I said, addressing the room. Family conflicts are best resolved in private, not in public. I apologize to all the guests for this unpleasant scene. No, Oliver Langley interjected. Now that you've started this circus, go on. Tell us why your son doesn't want to know you. What have you done that he refuses even to recognize you as his father? I looked at Elliot. His face was a mixture of rage and shame. He looked like both an angry man and a little boy who had been caught in a lie. After I divorced Elliot's mother, I continued to take care of my son. I began in a steady voice, paid for his education, his first car, his first apartment. But his mother led him to believe that I'd abandoned them for money and a career. It was a lie. I never stopped loving my son and hoping that one day he would realize the truth. You lie, Elliot exclaimed. You always put your precious business before your family. Mom and I were just a hindrance to your career. Is that what Audrey told you? I asked quietly. Did you ever wonder why, with my supposed neglect, I continued to pay all your expenses even after you became of age? Victoria shifted her gaze from me to Elliot, trying to comprehend what was happening. You never said your parents were divorced, she said to her husband. You said your mother was dead, and you don't talk to your father because of his alcoholism. I couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. Alcoholism? That's a new one. I don't drink anything stronger than wine with dinner. And your mother did die, Elliot, 5 years ago. I heard about it in the paper and sent flowers to the funeral, though I wasn't invited, of course. Sebastian Langley, who up to this point had been watching our squabble with growing discontent, intervened decisively. I think we should continue this conversation in a more private setting, he said, addressing the guests. Everyone, please return to the fun. Musicians, continue. The orchestra tentatively played a cheerful tune, but the atmosphere in the room remained tense. The guests were reluctant to leave, still looking back at us. Sebastian gestured for us to follow him. We, me, Elliot, Victoria, and the Langley brothers, went through a side door into a small room, obviously intended for negotiations. As soon as the door closed, Sebastian turned to Elliot, not hiding his anger. Explain yourself. Have you lied about your financial situation? About your family? What else have you lied about? Elliot looked cornered. I didn't lie about my job, he began to justify himself. I do work at Morgan & Reed. Just not in the position I said I was in. And yes, I exaggerated my finances. But only because I knew how important status is to you. Status? Sebastian was indignant. It's not about status, it's about integrity. You dragged my daughter into a marriage based on lies. Victoria stood back, wrapping her arms around herself as if she was cold. Her beautiful wedding dress, on which so much money and effort had been spent, now seemed like a misplaced masquerade costume. You said you had your own apartment downtown, she said quietly, that we'd live there after the honeymoon. I have an apartment, Elliot assured her hastily. It's just, I rent it, not own it. But it's only temporary until we save up for a place of our own. Save up? Oliver interjected with a sarcastic chuckle. With your $450,000 loan? You'll be paying it off until you retire. I watched the scene with a mixed feeling of bitterness and satisfaction. Elliot had built a house of cards of lies, and now it was crumbling before my eyes. May I ask, I turned to Sebastian, what does your daughter do? Does she have a profession? A job? Sebastian straightened, clearly hurt by my question. Victoria received an excellent education in Vassar. She does charity work and organizes cultural events. So she doesn't work, I summarized. And as I understand it, you plan for my son to provide for her lifestyle? The same son that you and your brothers ridiculed for his humble origins? I will not allow you to insult my daughter. Sebastian was indignant. I'm not insulting, I'm stating a fact, I said calmly. You have checked Elliot's background and financial situation, but have you inquired into his character? What kind of man he was? Or did you only care about how much money he could bring into your family? Father, please, Elliot interjected to my surprise, calling me father for the first time in years. I love Victoria, It has nothing to do with money or status? It doesn't? I turned to my son. Then why did you hide the truth about your financial situation from her? Why did you paint me as an alcoholic? Why did you try to impress the Langley family by getting into debts you couldn't pay off? Elliot couldn't come up with an answer. Victoria walked up to him, looking him straight in the eye. I want the truth, Elliot. The whole truth. Who are you really? He took a deep breath, as if gathering his strength. I'm a junior analyst at Morgan & Reed, not a junior partner. My salary is good, but not as impressive as I said it was. I don't have my own apartment, just a rented studio in the suburbs. And yes, I took out a huge loan to pay for this wedding because I wanted you to have the best. And your dad? She nodded in my direction. We really hadn't spoken in years. After my parents divorced, my mom turned me against him. She said he left us for his career, that he didn't care about his family. I believed her, and I hated him. And that's true? Victoria turned to me. Partly, I answered honestly. I did divorce Audrey when Elliot was 13, but I never stopped taking care of my son financially. I paid for his education, helped him with his first big purchases. Audrey turned him against me, and eventually we stopped talking altogether. What about your fortune? Edward Langley intervened. Are you really as rich as you claim to be? Or is it as false as your son's? I smiled. I can show you the bank statements if you're so interested. But believe me, I could have bought this hotel without a second thought, not just to pay for the wedding. Then why are you dressed like that? Oliver couldn't resist another stiletto, pointing to my old suit. Because a man's values aren't determined by the price of his clothes, I answered calmly. This suit is precious to me as a memory, not as a closet item. But of course, such things as sentimental value or respect for the past are hardly familiar to people for whom the most important thing in life is to impress. Sebastian seemed to consider my words for a moment, but quickly returned to his indignation. It doesn't change the fact that your son deceived my daughter and our entire family. He has presented himself as a completely different person. Did you give him a chance to be himself? I countered. With your questions of origin and status, with your arrogance and snobbery? He lied, it's true, and that's unforgivable. But think about what drove him to tell that lie. Victoria, who had been silently listening to our exchange of remarks, suddenly spoke. I want to know one thing, she said, looking at Elliot. Do you love me? Do you really love me? Not the image of a rich heiress to be conquered? Elliot took her hands in his, tears in his eyes. I love you more than anything in the world, Vicky. Yes, I've lied about many things, but never about my feelings for you. I was just afraid I wouldn't be good enough for you and your family the way I am. She stared into his eyes for a long time, as if trying to see the truth in his soul, then slowly released her hands. I need time to think about this, she said finally. I don't know if I can trust you after lying to you like that, and I'm not sure I want to start married life with a huge debt. Victoria, Sebastian said indignantly, you can't seriously consider continuing this marriage. The man is a fraud. That is for me to decide, Father. Her voice sounded unexpectedly firm. I am not a child, and this is my life. There was a tense silence in the room. I looked at my son, at his lost expression, and suddenly felt tired. Years of resentment and bitterness, culminating in this scene, seemed to be piling up on my shoulders all at once. Well, I said at last, I think I'll leave you to deal with your family matters. My part in this drama is done. Wait, Elliot took a step toward me. You can't just walk away after everything that's happened. What do you suggest? I asked. Go back to the wedding reception like nothing happened? Or maybe finally recognize me as your father in front of all the guests? Yeah, he hesitated, clearly unprepared for this turn. We need to talk. There's a lot of things I'd like to clear up. I've lived in La Vista for 15 years, Elliot, I said. All those years, you could have found me if you'd wanted to. But you came to my town, got married a few miles from my house, and didn't even think to let me know. I didn't know you lived here, he answered quietly. Didn't know or didn't want to know. I shook my head. Anyway, you have bigger problems right now. You need to decide what to do about your marriage and your debt, and I've got to go home. Mr. Hutton, Victoria said to me suddenly, I'd like to talk to you. Not now, but, perhaps tomorrow? Her request took me by surprise. I looked into her eyes, clear, intelligent, determined, and realized that she was stronger than she looked. Of course, I nodded. I'd be delighted. Victoria, Sebastian said indignantly. You can't be serious. I already told you, father, she interrupted him. This is my life and my decisions. I headed for the door, feeling the stares of everyone present. At the very exit, I turned around. Elliot, I said, looking at my son, no matter what happens, I will always be your father. And no matter what, I'm glad I saw you today. With those words, I left the room, leaving them to deal with the consequences of my unexpected appearance at the wedding. The banquet hall was still full of guests, but the music was muffled and tension hung in the air. People were talking in low voices, some of them openly discussing the scandal. I walked through the hall, trying to ignore the curious stares and whispers behind me. Gertrude Pembroke, my table mate, caught up with me at the exit. What a performance, Mr. Hutton, she said with undisguised admiration. I haven't seen Sebastian so flushed in a long time. It's good for him to come down to earth once in a while. I smiled weakly. I'm afraid I've spoiled your grandniece's wedding. Nonsense, she said. Victoria's a strong girl, and she'll figure it out. And if she doesn't, so be it. Anyway, family secrets tend to come out at the worst possible time. Better sooner than later. I nodded, agreeing with her wise words, and headed for the hotel exit. The evening air of La Vista was cool and fresh after the stuffy hall. I inhaled deeply, feeling the tension slowly leave my body. Well, I had done what I thought was right. Told the truth that had remained hidden for too long. The ball was now in Elliot's court, and it was up to him to decide what to do next. For the first time in years, I felt strangely relieved, as if the heavy weight I'd been carrying all this time had gotten a little lighter. I spent the next 3 days in the silence of my house thinking about what had happened at the wedding. The La Vista newspapers didn't mention the scandal. The Langley family had probably made sure that the information didn't leak out. The Secular Chronicle limited itself to a dry report on the wedding of the heiress of oil magnate Sebastian Langley and promising financier Elliot Hutton. Not a word about the sudden appearance of the groom's father and his shocking revelations. I didn't expect any of the newlyweds to contact me, but on the fourth day the doorbell rang. Opening it, I saw Elliot. He looked tired and gaunt, as if he hadn't slept in days. The dark circles under his eyes, the wrinkled shirt, the 3-day stubble, not a trace of the glossy groom I'd seen at the wedding. May I come in? He asked, not looking me in the eye. There was a cold determination in his voice. I stepped aside silently, letting him into the house. Elliot walked into the living room and stopped at the window, looking out at the manicured garden behind the house. It's a beautiful place, he said at last, with ill-concealed envy. How long have you lived here? 15 years, I answered, since I sold my share of the company and retired. He nodded, still not turning toward me. Victoria's gone, he said after a long pause, and his voice shook. Filed for an annulment. Said she couldn't start married life on a lie. I sighed. A sad but predictable development. I'm sorry, Elliot. You are? He turned sharply, a glint of unconcealed rage in his eyes. You're sorry? You ruined my wedding, made me look like a liar in front of the entire Langley family, and now you're sorry? I didn't make you lie, I replied calmly, and I didn't hide the truth about our bloodline. You made your choice when you decided to pretend you didn't know me. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with his emotions. Why did you come here in the first place? Who asked you to show up at my wedding? I wanted to see my son, I answered simply. 20 years is a long time. I thought a wedding would be a good excuse to reconcile. Reconciliation? Elliot grinned bitterly. After everything you've done? What exactly have I done, Elliot? I looked at him carefully. Tell me your side of the story. He slumped back in his chair, looking even more tired and embittered. You left Mom and me, chose your career and money over your family, cheated on Mom with young secretaries, and when she got sick, you wouldn't even help her. I stared at him for a long time, realizing the extent of the lies Audrey had instilled in our son. None of it is true, Elliot, I said at last. I never cheated on your mother. I never chose career over family. And I didn't know about her illness. She kept it from me. like so many other things. You're lying, he jumped up from his chair. Mom told me everything. How you used to come home late at night, smelling of perfume. How you missed my school appearances because of business meetings. How you refused to pay for her treatment when she was diagnosed with cancer. Cancer? I was stunned. Audrey had cancer? When? Did you even forget that? Elliot threw in contemptuously. When I was 15. She needed experimental therapy that insurance wouldn't cover. You refused to help, said it wasn't your problem. I slowly sank down onto the couch, trying to comprehend this information. Elliot, I swear to you, I didn't know anything about your mother's cancer. She never came to me for help with treatment, never. Something in my voice, in my face, must have made him doubt. He stared into my eyes as if trying to find the lie there. It's impossible, he said at last. Mom said, she showed me a letter from you refusing to pay. A letter? I shook my head. I never wrote such a letter. Elliot, your mother manipulated you for years, turning you against me. I'm not a saint or a perfect father, but I never refused to take care of you or help Audrey. Elliot looked confused, his confidence beginning to waver. But Mom, she wouldn't. She was very hurt after the divorce, I said softly. And unfortunately, she decided to get back at me through you. That's the cruelest thing one parent can do to another, to deprive of communication with the child. I stood up and walked over to the secretary against the wall. Opening one of the drawers, I pulled out a file folder. Here, I handed him a stack of papers. Receipts for all the payments I made in your name and your mother's. College, car, down payment on the apartment, and monthly transfers to Audrey's account that continued even after you became an adult. Way more than the child support demanded. Elliot looked through the documents slowly, his face changing as he read. But Mom said, she said you only paid what the court made you pay and always tried to avoid even that. Your mother said a lot of things that weren't true, I sighed, and about my supposed cheating and neglecting my family. But you did work hard, he argued bitterly. You were never home. Yes, I worked hard, I admitted, especially in the early years when I was building the business. But not because I preferred work to family, but because I wanted to give you and your mother a decent life. I missed a few of your school events, and I regret it. But I've been to most of them. Your mother she selectively reminded you only when I wasn't there. Elliot sat with his head down, still holding the papers in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly. Why didn't you fight for me? He asked quietly, but his voice sounded more like a reproach than a sincere question. I sighed heavily. I tried, Elliot. The first few years I tried to explain the truth to you, but you were a teenager, full of anger and resentment. You didn't want to listen, and then you just stopped coming to our meetings. You stopped answering calls and emails. By the time you were 18, you were completely estranged from me. Mom said you only called to fight with her about money, he muttered, that your letters were full of accusations and threats. I never threatened your mother, I said firmly, and I never fought with her about money. I paid whatever she asked, hoping it would at least partially compensate for my physical absence from your life. We sat in silence for a while. I could see Elliot struggling with himself, trying to reconcile what he had believed for 20 years with the facts I had presented to him. Do you still have my letters? I asked at last. He shook his head. No. Mother, she used to read me excerpts from them and then throw them away. Said they would only upset me. I see, I nodded. Now think about it, Elliot. If I really was such a terrible father, why did I keep paying for everything even when you stopped talking to me? Why did I keep track of your accomplishments through mutual friends? Why did I keep your baby pictures and school awards all these years? I walked over to the closet and pulled out another folder, this time with photos. Elliot's school pictures, newspaper clippings of his math Olympiad wins, his graduation program, a college graduation picture I'd gotten from the county. I never stopped being your father, Elliot, I said quietly, even when you decided I wasn't worthy of being a part of your life. Elliot stared at the pictures for a long moment, then looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and underlying hostility. Let's say, he said finally, let's say that not everything Mom said was true, but that doesn't change what you've done to me now. You ruined my life. I ruined the lie you were trying to build your life on, I corrected him. And believe me, it would have fallen apart sooner or later. A marriage based on deception can't be happy. It's not for you to judge, he snapped. You couldn't even save your own marriage. His words were like a punch in the face, but I forced myself to stay calm. You're right, I agreed. I'm not the best expert on family life, but one thing I do know is that the truth always comes out, especially when it comes to money and debt. What would you do when Victoria found out about your loan? When she realized you'd lied about your financial situation? I would have handled it, he said stubbornly, but there was no confidence in his voice. Maybe, I didn't argue, but we'll never know now. What's done is done. I came to your wedding hoping for a reconciliation. You chose to pretend you didn't know me. I found out about your duty and I couldn't keep my mouth shut. We all made our choices and now we live with the consequences. Elliot stood up abruptly, clutching the photographs in his hands. That's not why I came here, he said. Not to hear your excuses or your accusations. I came to tell you that because of you, I've lost everything. My wife, my relationship with her family, my career prospects. Sebastian Langley withdrew his recommendation from the company. I've been demoted. I can barely pay the interest on my loan, let alone the principal. He threw the photos on the table. And you know what the worst part is? That you're standing here in your fancy house with your millions, telling me you did the right thing, that you ruined my life for some abstract truth, like you had the right to do that. I looked at my son, seeing Audrey's reflection in him, the same way of shifting responsibility onto others, the same unwillingness to admit my own mistakes. I didn't ruin your life, Elliot, I said quietly. You did when you decided to base your future on a lie, when you took out a loan you couldn't afford, when you pretended to be someone you're not. I just took off the mask you put on yourself. And now you feel like a hero? He asked bitterly. A great fighter for the truth? No, I shook my head. I feel like a father who spent 20 years hoping to repair his relationship with his son, but in the end only deepened the gulf between us. We stood across from each other, separated not only by physical space but by years of hurt, misunderstandings, and mutual grievances. In his eyes I saw a reflection of my own pain, but also the intransigence I had inherited from my mother. Why did you come, Elliot? I asked at last. What do you want from me? He was silent for a long moment, as if he were unsure of the answer. Then he squared his shoulders and looked me straight in the eye. I want you to pay off my loan, he said bluntly. You said yourself that you could easily pay for the whole wedding. What's $450,000 to you? A drop in the ocean. For me, it's a financial hole for years. I expected that, but I still felt a sharp stab of disappointment. No reconciliation, no attempt to understand each other, just money. Always just money. And what happens after I pay off your debt? I asked calmly. Will we be separated again for 20 years? Are you going to pretend I don't exist until you need another bailout? I don't know, he answered honestly. I can't promise anything. There was too much going on, too many resentments building up. At least he was honest about that. I sighed and shook my head slowly. I won't pay your debt, Elliot. His face contorted with anger and disbelief. What? But you said yourself that it meant nothing to you, that you could have paid for the whole wedding. I could have, I agreed, if you'd come to me like a son instead of a man who pretends not to know me, if you'd been honest with me, with Victoria, with her family, if you'd asked for help instead of taking it for granted. I don't believe that, he shook his head. All this time, all you've done is talk about how you'd like to rebuild the relationship, and now that you have the chance, you refuse? Relationships aren't bought with money, Elliot, I replied. I don't want to be an ATM you only turn to when you're in financial trouble. I want to be your father. And I want to get out of debt, he exclaimed. I can't pay my rent. I've lost my wife, my position, my respect, all because of you. You owe me, damn it. I don't owe you anything. I shook my head. I've fulfilled all my financial obligations to you and your mother. What's more, I've paid far more than the law requires. If you need money to pay off your debts, get a job, sell things you don't need, take a part-time job. Do what all adults do when faced with financial hardship. Elliot looked at me with such unconcealed contempt that for a moment I saw Audrey in him, the same grimace, the same look in his eyes when she didn't get what she wanted. "You're pathetic," he said through gritted teeth. "All this time keeping pictures of me, watching my life from afar. For what? So you could refuse to help me at a crucial moment? To feel superior?" "No, Elliot," I shook my head. "I kept the connection, however tenuous, because I loved you. Because I hoped that one day you would see the truth. But it seems you're too much like your mother for that to happen. Don't you dare talk about her." He took a step towards me, and for a moment I thought he was going to hit me. But instead, he turned around abruptly and headed for the exit. At the door, he stopped and turned around. "You know, Mom was right about you," he said bitterly. "You always chose money over family. It's just that this time you decided not to spend it, but to keep it." With that, he walked out, slamming the door loudly. I stood in the empty living room for a long time, staring at the photos scattered across the table. The traces of a life I'd missed, the moments I'd never get back. A feeling of devastation and bitterness came over me with renewed vigor. I knew I'd done the right thing by refusing to just give Elliot the money. It wouldn't have been helping, but indulging his habit of avoiding responsibility, of shifting blame to others. But that knowledge didn't make it any easier. I had lost my son for the second time, and now it seemed to be final. A few days later, I received a letter from Elliot's lawyer demanding compensation for the moral damage caused by my unacceptable behavior at the wedding. The amount of compensation was exactly the same as the amount of his loan. I handed the letter to my lawyer and never heard from my son or his lawyer again. Victoria did not contact me as I had secretly hoped. Apparently, she preferred to put the whole affair behind her and start her life over, free of lies, debt, and toxic relationships. I couldn't blame her. Life was slowly returning to normal. I was once again spending my days in the quiet of my home, in the company of books and memories. But something had changed in me since that meeting with my son. The bitterness I had carried around for years began to give way to a strange sense of release. I did everything I could. I tried to reach Elliot, to show him the truth, to give him a chance at a new, honest relationship. He chose a different path. And though it hurt, I began to accept that fact. At the end of the day, we are all hostage to our decisions. And sometimes the wisest thing to do is to just let go of the things we can't change. It's been 2 weeks since Elliot left my house with a loud slam of the door. In that time, I haven't received a call or a text. Just that formal letter from the lawyer with ridiculous demands for compensation. I was almost resigned to the idea that our last meeting was indeed the final point in our relationship when one overcast Thursday the doorbell rang. Elliot was there again, but he looked different from the last time I'd seen him. His expensive suit had been replaced by worn jeans and a simple shirt. His neat haircut had grown out and looked unkempt. But the main change was in his eyes. Instead of anger and accusation, they were a mixture of despair and determination. "I need to talk to you," he said without preamble. "It's important." I led him into the house in silence. Elliot walked into the living room and got straight to the point without even sitting down. "I've come to ask for your help again," he began, clearly choosing his words carefully. "The situation is critical. The bank is threatening to hand over the case to collectors if I do not start paying the principal amount of the debt. I've tried to find additional work, sold my car, but it's not enough. At my current salary, it's going to take me at least 15 years to pay off the loan." To pay off the loan. I listened to him without interrupting, noting how carefully he was trying to control his tone, avoiding the accusations and recriminations that had filled our last meeting. "I realize you don't have to help me," he continued. "After everything that has happened between us, you have every right to refuse. But I'm asking you to consider the fact that this debt is ruining my life. I can't move on. I can't make plans. I can't even sleep well at night thinking about the interest that keeps going up." He finally sat down in the chair across from me, and I could see how exhausted he really was. The dark circles under his eyes, the unhealthy pallor, the nervous twitching of his fingers. Everything spoke of a man on the verge of exhaustion. "What happened to Victoria?" I asked. "Cherry, was she gone for good?" Elliot nodded, a grimace of pain flashing across his face. "She filed for an annulment. Said she couldn't be with a man who'd built a relationship on lies. Her father helped expedite the process. Sebastian Langley made sure I was demoted too, because he had connections in the company." "I'm sorry," I said sincerely. Sorry? He couldn't hold back a bitter chuckle. You ruined my life, and now you say you're sorry? I didn't ruin your life, Elliot, I said calmly. You made the decisions that brought you here. I only told you the truth you were trying to hide. He opened his mouth to contradict me, but then he hesitated and took a deep breath. I don't want to argue again, he said, obviously making an effort to remain polite. I came here with a specific request. Help me pay off this loan. I'm willing to sign whatever papers I want, and I'll pay you back as soon as I can. You can set a repayment schedule, an interest rate, whatever you think is fair. I scrutinized his face, trying to figure out what was really driving him. Sincere remorse or just financial desperation? What makes you think I should help you? I asked bluntly. After everything you said the last time we met, after that letter from the lawyer, what's changed? Elliot hesitated, clearly not expecting such a question. Yeah, I was desperate, he admitted reluctantly. The letter from the lawyer was a stupid idea. I withdrew the suit the next day. It just didn't seem fair to me that you were living in luxury and I was barely making ends meet because of that loan. And you think you're entitled to my money just because I'm your biological father? I asked. No, he shook his head. Not just because of that. But isn't it natural to help your children in difficult situations, especially if it's a small amount of money for you? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at my manicured garden, which was slowly preparing for fall. The trees were beginning to change color. Some leaves had already fallen, making way for the new life that would come in the spring. You know, Elliot, all these years I've dreamed of you and me being a family again, I began without turning around. I imagined you coming to this house not as a petitioner or an accuser, but as a son who wanted to know his father. I kept your pictures, watched your progress from afar, was proud of you even when you thought I was a stranger. I turned to him, but the reality was different. You only came to me when you needed money. You don't want to know me. You don't want to understand. You don't even try to forgive. You just want me to pay your debts. That's not fair, Elliot objected. Mom's been turning me against you for years. You admitted it yourself. How can I suddenly forget everything I've been taught since I was a child? I'm not asking you to forget. I shook my head. I'm asking you to try to understand. But even now, you're not here to fix things, only to help me financially. Elliot rose from his chair, anger flaring in his eyes again. So this is a test? You're testing to see if I'm repentant enough? Am I sincere enough to want to repair the relationship? Or is this just revenge for avoiding you for years? No, Elliot, I shook my head. This isn't a test or revenge. It's just a statement of fact. You came to me not as a son to a father, but as a debtor to a banker. And I don't want that kind of relationship. What kind of relationship do you want? Now there was open mockery in his voice. Sentimental conversations about the past? Fishing trips and weekend barbecues? I'm 38 years old, not 8. Our time for that kind of relationship was long past. His words hurt me, but I didn't show it. Maybe you're right, I agreed. Maybe we did miss our chance for a normal father-son relationship. But that doesn't mean I should just give you money every time you get into financial trouble. Not every time, he objected. I've never asked you for help before. This is the first and probably the last time. The last time because after this, you'll disappear from my life again? I asked bluntly. Until the next financial crisis? Elliot looked away, and that gesture told me more than any words could. I thought so, I nodded. I'm sorry, Elliot, but I won't pay your debt. Not because I can't or won't help you, but because it would be wrong. You're a grown man. You made the choice to take out this loan, and now you have to take responsibility for your actions. He looked at me with undisguised contempt. Just like that? You refuse to help your own son when you could do so without the slightest harm to yourself? I refuse to be used, I corrected. There's a difference between helping and indulging in irresponsibility. Irresponsibility, he almost shouted. I took out this loan to do Victoria's dream wedding, so she and her family wouldn't be ashamed of me. And I lied to them about my financial situation, I reminded him, not to mention the fact that you pretended not to recognize your own father. What more proof of irresponsibility do you need? Elliot stood in the middle of the room, clenching and unclenching his fists. I could see the anger and despair struggling in him, the way he tried to find the words to change my mind. "So this is your final decision?" he finally asked. "You won't give me the money?" "No," I confirmed firmly. "But I can offer you something else. I can help you find a better job. I still have connections in the business world. I can help you come up with a plan to restructure your debt so that your repayment terms are more forgiving. I can even offer to let you live here temporarily to save on rent. Charity instead of real help." He grinned bitterly. "Thank you, but I can manage on my own." He headed for the exit but stopped at the door and turned around. "You know, Mom was right about you. Money has always been more important to you than family. It's just that you used to spend it to buy off responsibility, and now you save it to feel morally superior. You still don't get it, do you?" I shook my head. "It's not about the money, Elliot. It never has been. It's that you only see me as a wallet, not a person, not the father who loved you all these years despite your alienation." "Loved?" He laughed bitterly. "It's a strange way to show love, to refuse help when you really need it." "True love doesn't always mean giving what's asked for," I replied. "Sometimes it means doing what's right, even if it hurts." He shook his head like he was talking to a crazy person. "Goodbye," he said briefly. "I won't bother you again." With those words, he walked out of the house, closing the door carefully behind him. No dramatic slamming this time, just the quiet click of the lock, which was perhaps more final than any loud exit. I stood in the middle of the room for a long time, realizing that I had just completely lost my son. Not because of Audrey's lies, not because of the scandal at the wedding, but because of my own decision. I could have just given him the money, solved his problems with the stroke of a pen, maybe even earned some form of gratitude, but that wouldn't have been the right decision. Not for him, not for me. A strange sense of peace gradually spilled inside me. I had made a difficult choice, but it was an honest choice. I hadn't allowed myself to be used, hadn't agreed to a relationship built on financial dependence rather than mutual respect and love. Looking at the garden outside my window, at the slowly falling leaves, I realized it was time to let go of the past. For 20 years, I had lived with the hope of reconciliation with my son, of restoring family ties that may have existed only in my imagination. I kept photos, letters, memories, clinging to the image of a little boy who had long since grown up and become a stranger. It was time to start living in the present, not the past. Not for Elliot, not for Audrey's ghost, but for myself. At 73, it's not too late to start a new chapter of life, to find new interests, new people, new joys. I walked over to the closet where the albums of Elliot's childhood photos were kept and ran my hand over the spines. Not to throw them away, no, these memories would always be a part of me, but put away, not let them take center stage in my life. Maybe someday Elliot will understand. Maybe someday he'll come back, not for the money, but for real companionship. Or maybe he won't. Either way, I will no longer live my life waiting for that moment. Resolutely closing the closet, I made my way to my office and pulled out of my desk drawer a folder of ideas and plans I'd been putting off for years. The trip to Europe I'd always dreamed of. The photography courses that had been drawing me in, but that I had never dared to enroll in. Volunteering at the local animal shelter. All of this now seemed not just possible, but necessary. A way to give my life meaning that didn't depend on Elliot's or anyone else's recognition. I felt strangely light, as if the heavy weight I'd been carrying all these years had finally fallen from my shoulders. No more obligations to a toxic family. No more illusions of repairing a relationship that may never have been healthy. Just the freedom to choose my own path, to live my own life. I picked up my phone and dialed the number of the travel agency. It was time to book that tour of Italy that I had been dreaming of since I retired. Life is short, especially at my age, and I decided not to waste any more of it waiting for a miracle that would likely never happen. As I waited for the cameraman to respond, my gaze fell on the picture of little Elliot on the table, the only one I'd left in plain sight. A boy with a fishing rod holding his first catch with an enthusiastic smile. I smiled at that memory, but no longer without the same old bitterness. That boy will remain in my heart forever, even if the grown man he became chose a different path. "Mediterranean tours, how can I help you?" A cheerful female voice answered the phone. I would like to book a tour of Italy, I replied, for one person, and if possible, as soon as possible. A new chapter of my life was beginning, and I was ready to turn the page.